Hello and welcome to our Zoom. Today we're going to be talking all about algae. My name is Katie Nichols and I'm the Marine Restoration Director for Orange County Coastkeeper. And I'll be talking a little bit on an overview of what algae is and the main types. We'll talk a little bit about invasive species, algal blooms, and then finish talking about some products and uses. So algae are a large, diverse group of oxygenic, phototrophic, eukaryotic microorganisms. It's kind of a mouthful. So eukaryotic means they have a nucleus, and this is what differentiates them from bacteria and photosynthetic like cyanobacteria, which is actually mislabeled as a blue-green algae, but it's not actually an alga, it's a bacteria. And so they're oxygenic phototrophs, meaning they use light as their energy source for growth and produce oxygen through photosynthesis like plants. But what distinguishes them from plants is that algae don't have any tissue differentiation. So what that means is plants differentiate their tissues into roots, trunks, leaves, all very different tissue types. In contrast, algae are composed of cells that are generally all the same, even though they do have some structure to them, which you'll see in a minute in some photos. Okay, I want everybody to take a deep breath, let it out. Take another deep breath and exhale. You can thank algae for that second breath, as every other breath we take comes from algae, which provides over half the oxygen on Earth. In addition to providing oxygen for us to breathe, algae form the basis of the marine food web and also many freshwater food webs. Now, although people have known about algae and even eaten it for thousands of years, it's only been studied scientifically for the last about 300 years or so. And the study of algae is called phycology. Common terms for algae you may have heard are pond scum, seaweeds, rockweed, sea rack, and even frog spittle. Thus, poor algae kind of get a bad rap and a negative connotation when we talk about them. And since most people don't learn about algae in school, awareness of them might derive from mainly bad situations, such as news about poisonous red tides or shellfish poisoning, or maybe even algal problems in things like a swimming pool. But algae are pretty cool. I've talked a lot about eelgrass in the past. That's a plant that lives in the water that's also very cool. But today we're going to talk about algae. So what are the big types? So the big algae is the seaweeds, and there are three main groups of this. So green algae, what most people may be familiar with if you think about algae, there are about 6,000 to 8,000 species of green algae, and that's really just an estimate. And actually 90% of them are freshwater rather than marine. Then we have our red algae. So there are 4,000 to 5,000 species of red algae. And in contrast to the green algae, about 90% of red algae are marine. There are some unicellular red algae, but most are these larger algae growing abundantly on rocky shores. And so a couple different types you can see in the upper right corner is one of my favorites. It's called a Turkish towel. Feels almost like a washcloth. In the middle is a crustose coralline algae. Coralline algae are algae that make calcium carbonate structures, and these are often a really important component of coral reefs, and actually the major component in some reefs. Next we have the brown algae, the Phaeophyta. These can be thought of as the macho algae, so the big giant kelp, as well as some smaller, tougher intertidal seaweeds. There are only about 15 to 2,000 species of brown algae, and they're almost entirely marine. This group includes well-known species like sargassum and giant kelp, or Macrocystis pyrifera, which forms large forests. So if you're ever out looking along the coast and you see some brown stuff on the top, it may be part of a kelp forest. You can see this picture in the side on the right. That's the giant kelp, or Macrocystis, also in the inset. It has a pretty unique structure. So those ball-like structures that you're seeing, those are called nematocysts. And those have air in them, and that's what allows the macrocystis to float vertically in the water column. They're attached to the bottom. You can see a picture of a different species, but what that bottom root-like structure, it's called a holdfast, and that's what keeps them anchored to rocks. If you're lucky, you might see one of those holdfast washed up on the beach. And they provide a really cool habitat for a lot of different critters like invertebrates and brittle stars. We also have one of my other favorites in the brown algae group is called feather boa kelp. And you can see how it gets its name. It's also, scientific name is Eisenia. It also has those nematocysts and has a really cool structure. You might be lucky enough to see that. It's another fairly common algae along our coasts. So next I want to talk about small algae, so phytoplankton. Phytoplankton often aren't noticeable compared to the seaweeds. They're pretty small unless there's a big bloom. So small algae includes things like diatoms and dinoflagellates. And these are just some pictures of what those look like close up. These are what are responsible for things like harmful algal blooms and red tides. So red tides have occurred over thousands of years. These are blooms of microscopic algae. And these algae are important because they feed zooplankton. And zooplankton feeds things like krill and small fish. And so the zooplankton is feeding on that phytoplankton, so it supports the whole food web and is super essential. If you've ever seen a red tide along our coast, it would be primarily this species that's shown up in the upper right corner. This is what causes a lot of our red tides in Southern California. It's a dinoflagellate. Now, red tides are natural, but scientists are concerned that there's been an increase in the number of blooms each year, and they're occurring in parts of the world that they've never occurred in before. So this increased red tides might be a result of human activity, like increasing nutrients in our coastal waters. So that's why it's really important as a coastkeeper and as water stewards or water warriors that we protect the water quality and make sure we're not pumping in excess nutrients or pollutants to cause more toxic red tides. Now, in California, the majority of red tides aren't caused by species that produce toxins like domoic acid. You might be familiar with domoic acid causing toxicity and causes of mortality in sea lions. But not all of these red tides are toxic. There are some that also cause the paralytic shellfish poisoning, but it depends on the type of algae whether or not it's producing toxins. But this red tide that we had here actually recently in April, the next photo shows you what this red tide can look like at night. And it makes this what's called bioluminescence. So that's a biological production of light. So these photosynthetic phytoplankton are swimming upward to the light and create a thin layer on the surface. And when they're disturbed, they glow. And so I like to think of it as kind of like a little tiny organism calling the police. So if you're a tiny fish swimming through, biting some phytoplankton, it's going to set off an alarm so larger fish will hopefully come and eat that plankton. Now, this recent bloom that we had, photographers and some folks were lucky enough to capture it. I'm going to post some links online on our social media today. You could actually see some dolphins swimming through bioluminescent water at night. Really cool stuff to check out if you're lucky enough to ever see bioluminescence in the ocean at night. I highly recommend checking it out. And then lastly, I wanted to talk a little bit about invasive algae and what we can do about it. So two main types of invasives we have here. One is called Caulerpa. It's also known as the scourge of the Mediterranean. It's a highly invasive weed that was introduced back in the 80s. It's pretty problematic. And then another one that you might be familiar with is called Sargassum horneri. And Sargassum horneri is a large annual brown algae native to shallow reefs of Japan and Korea. It was first discovered in Long Beach Harbor in 2003. And since then, it's become highly invasive in rocky reef habitats, all the way down from the Channel Islands all the way down to Mexico. It's also known as the devilweed. And here we're showing you a picture of what Sargassum horneri looks like in this left-hand column. It's a little bit more like fluffy, and why it's problematic is that it can crowd out the native species, that giant kelp or Macrocystis, and it doesn't provide quite the nutritional habitat, nutritional content or the habitat that Macrocystis does. So it doesn't have that big, large holdfast, doesn't provide the same vertical structure and canopy that giant kelp does. So it's highly invasive and very problematic. But fortunately, some water keepers and researchers are tracking it and trying to prevent the spread. So if you look at this sheet we have here online, you can go to the website, marineinvasives.org, that site down on the left-hand corner, and you can actually report sightings of these invasive species and help scientists track it. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about how algae is used. So some scientists I knew of at NOAA were actually using that Sargassum horneri to brew beer, and algae has a bunch of other uses as well. So our major gas and oil deposits that are rapidly depleting came largely from prehistoric algae deposits. And various kinds of algae are also sources for new pharmaceutical compounds, which can help in our battles against antibiotic resistant strains of bacteria, viral infections like herpes and AIDS. Algae can also be used to fight some forms of cancer. They're also a potential source of renewable biofuels, a source that from many perspectives might be more manageable than using land plants like corn or sugarcane, because algae are really efficient harvesters of sunlight, and they don't waste much energy on intricate structures and flowers, and they can also grow in brackish or salt water, so you don't need a lot of land to grow and harvest them. So it might be a way of more sustainable aquaculture. And I mentioned that Macrocystis is harvested and used for things as well. It can grow up to 3 feet a day, giant kelp can, and it's harvested for alginic acid. And that's a polysaccharide, so a sugar, and it's used in industrial things, thickening food products, things like even paper, all the way to beer brewing, like I mentioned. Red algae is the source of compounds called agar and carrageenans. It's another polysaccharide, and you can find this in beer, as I mentioned, ice cream, shampoo, your toothpaste. So if you check out the labels, you might see carrageenan on your toothpaste, or on things that are like creamy, like a body wash perhaps. Even soy milk and pet foods can have algae in them as well. Red algae is the source of porphyria, not to be confused with porifera, another species, but harvested, that's what is known as nori. That's a dark purple reddish paper used in sushi around the world. And I have an example of something similar to that. If you're still thinking, oh, algae is gross and slimy and weird and I wouldn't touch sushi, you might want to try something called furikake. This is a seasoning that has sesame seeds and dried green seaweed. Highly delicious if you want to dabble in some algae. I hope you guys have learned a little bit more about algae. If you have any questions, come and visit our website at coastkeeper.org, and check us out again on our next Zoom. Thank you.